Good evening. While everybody else is getting mic'd, let me welcome all of you to the forum at the John F. Kennedy School of Government and the Institute of Politics, and to welcome you on behalf both of the school and the Institute. And it's my privilege tonight. I'm Dutch Leonard. I'm the school's academic dean for the teaching programs, and it is in my among my opportunities here, my great privilege this evening to moderate what I think you will find will be a very interesting discussion on the Clinton economic plan and what might have been as well as what will be. We have a very distinguished panel with us tonight, and I want to take a moment in a second to introduce each of the panelists to you briefly, and each of them can add something if they wish about the particular perspectives that they bring to our discussion. But first, let me say just a minute about our format. We want to do this in a relatively informal way, which, as you see, we're all arrayed before you in what we call living room style, because we want to have this be an informal interchange among the panelists for the first half of our discussion, about 45 minutes or so. And then we'll go to questions from the floor. I'll give you some warning when that's about to happen so that people can come down to the microphones before that. But we want to do this rather than in the form of opening statements from the panelists. We'll simply go to a general discussion about some of the issues we want to talk about tonight. As I say, we won't have opening speeches unless one or another of the panelists is seized with the motivation to offer us a comment on one thing or another, which they are, of course, welcome to do. Let me now introduce the panelists to you briefly, and as I say, each of them can add a word as they begin to speak about what other perspectives they want you to know that they're speaking from. First, on my far left is Bo Cutter, who is the Deputy Assistant to the President for Economic Policy in the White House. He comes to his White House service from lengthy experience in the private sector, particularly at Coopers and Lybrand. He has degrees from Harvard. He was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, which I think gives you some clues as to where he might have met whom and what he might have been doing in the interim. And he has shown only one notable, at least on his resume, notable lapse of judgment, which is that he has a degree from the Woodrow Wilson School of Public Policy. He has also taught economics and about the federal budget to a variety of people, and comes to us to speak from that perspective. Next, also from the left, is Lynn Martin, currently an institute left. To the right of both, to be sure, is Lynn Martin, currently an Institute of Politics fellow, most recently Secretary of Labor, and someone who worked on two issues as Secretary of Labor. First, the development of high-wage, high-skilled jobs, and second, the expansion of opportunities and the removal of glass ceilings above various population groups. As in her work, she came before being Secretary of Labor, was a member of Congress for 10 years, and worked on the Rules Committee, on House Armed Services, in the Public Works area, and also on the Budget Committee. So it brings to us a wide range of perspectives on the federal budget tonight. Lynn, we're delighted to have you with us as well. Next, we didn't do this exactly in the order of the political spectrum, so I hope you'll keep that in mind as you hear from people on the panel tonight. Jim Moody is also an Institute of Politics fellow, formerly, again, a congressman for 10 years on the Ways and Means Committee and in Public Works and Transportation, so again has a variety of different perspectives on federal spending. He was a member of the Wisconsin State Legislature, and also earlier in his youth taught economics and as an assistant professor, and therefore comes both with the perspective of economics and long service working on budgetary matters, was a member of the Clinton transition team on the budget, and brings that perspective to us as well. Finally, on my immediate left, John White, the new director of Harvard's, the Kennedy School's Center for Business and Government. John also formerly taught economics, was an assistant secretary in the Defense Department, has worked both in the public and the private sectors extensively, was deputy director of OMB, worked at RAND in the private sector, most recently worked at Eastman Kodak, was also the issues director for the Perot Petition Committee, in which he worked on the development of the Perot economic plan. He worked on the Clinton transition team on the budget, and he is also a member of the Concord Coalition, which, as many of you know, is the Rudman and Tsongas effort to get America to take seriously the issue of the budget deficit. So he brings to us multiple perspectives simultaneously. He has been on more different sides of the political issues here, as he would have it on the same side but in different camps of the political issues here than anyone else we can name. We feel welcome with me all members of the panel. We're delighted to have each of you with us in bringing these perspectives. The topic of tonight's forum was the Clinton budget / economic plan, at whose expense? And what I wanted to ask the panelists to talk about first is the question about what value choices you see being made in the Clinton plan and in the Clinton budget. Ultimately, politics is the name we give to the method we use, at least in this society, for resolving choices about values in the society. And the budget, to at least many people who've worked on it, comes to be a principal instrument that intermediates those choices, in which value choices that we make as members of the society become embedded. And the question I wanted to focus us on first is, how different are those value choices as a result of the fact that it is the Clinton team that is in the White House and making those choices than it would have been had the Bush team remained in the White House or had the Perot team entered the White House? Let me ask Bo Cutter if he would start, because he is the one who's been most directly involved with both the formulation of the Clinton budget and its early operation. Bo?
I think that there were, Dutch warned us that we might get this question, so I'm a little bit more prepared than I normally would be. I think that there are really four kinds of values, or four specific areas that represent clear choices. And I'm not going to give either a campaign speech or a stump speech for the, I'll just try to describe them. First, there is as those of you who attended the dinner, is the area of the plan that John White disagrees with, is that there is embedded within it a stimulus program. And we can talk later about whether you like it or hate it or think that it matters, but it represents a very clear judgment on the part of the president as to the problems that we've seen coming out of this recession, the fact that it's faltered twice, and the need to do what one can do within the ranges of prudence to make certain that that doesn't happen again. That's sort of area one, and it, I think, really has to do with a fairly high value placed on jobs now. The second area of choice has to do with the investment program that he built into the plan. As all of you know, the plan incorporates, I'm going to use the year 1997 because it's easier for me to think in terms of the year that we did the plan, was sort of our marker year, that the plan incorporates approximately $40 billion worth of public sector spending that is built into the plan for 1997. And all of that represents a value, a perspective about the value of public investment, which again, one can argue is or is not a legitimate value. One can argue whether or not it yields a social rate of return. I'm happy to have those arguments, but it represents a very clear perspective, which probably would not have happened in another variant of the plan. Didn't happen in other variants of the plan. Third, I think, is the nature of the tax package itself. The energy part of it really isn't distinctly different than other plans that have been put forward. I think that really, once again, the point that you can make about the nature of the tax package and the value expressed is the extraordinary concern for progressivity that the president reflected in it and the plan reflects. Strangely enough, I'm not going to say, I'm going to make a final point, but I'm not going to say that the actual spending choices reflect that. I think that when you look at the budget, John and I were in the Carter White House together, and we have both looked at a lot of budgets, and there are certain categories, they don't change, the numbers are all known, there's no hidden pot for fraud and abuse, there's no sort of set of easy budget reductions that some set of people within the Beltway in Washington know about and others don't. So that I don't think the actual portfolio of reductions really is vastly different than others would have been. That's my fourth point. My final point, though, is I think the biggest single choice And the biggest single value reflected is the fact that he did it. Of all of that other people have had that opportunity, other people have had have had the choice. This president did it, and that I think reflects the sort of ultimate value decision. However it may look now, however it may look in a couple of years, at the time that we were going through this president thought he was betting the presidency on this set of issues, the decisions.
Good. Let me, because Lynn asked me to do this, turn next to Jim Moody to comment also from the perspective of, is the Clinton plan really different? What are the major choices? And then we'll come back and ask Lynn to comment from another perspective.
Well, I think Bo has covered some important points that I would have made had I been called on first. He did it very well. I think for me, the most distinguishing feature of the Clinton plan is really has nothing to do with any specific proposal, but rather the courage of the plan. I mean, as Bo said, a number of people have had the opportunity, since we knew the deficit was in the magnitude it is now, to do something serious about it. And for a number of years, and that goes back quite a way, no one has really taken it this seriously and has pushed the envelope out on what they're willing to stand behind the way that Bill Clinton has. He's taken on Social Security, which no one's been willing to do, in the sense that he's willing to substantially raise the taxes on Social Security receipts if you're above a certain income level. He's unapologetically embraced taxes, the T word, which was the no-use word for presidents for quite a while. Presidents relatively recently ran on promising never, 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 ever, never, ever, ever to raise taxes. I think energy taxes was a courageous step because the knowledgeable folks know that we have to raise the price of energy to make it more competitive and more conservation-minded. A number of sacred cows got goaded. Water fees, grazing fees, timber fees, the sort of things that previous administrations have not been willing to take seriously, although those in the know have been calling for those changes for years. So I'd say the hallmark of this package is courage, political courage in the best sense of the term.
Lynn, would you comment on how different you see the value choices as being?
Yes, I'd be happy to. First of all, it's a pleasure to be at Harvard. It's the only place I've ever been where I'm always on the far right. It's pure pleasure for me. And being Cassandra has always been a rather lonely game. So again, as a minority of a minority of a minority tonight, I will suggest that there are some good things about a budget, but perhaps a lot more salesmanship than reality is going on. First of all, of course there would be differences depending upon whom would be elected. And if the object of this budget were purely deficit reduction, it would not be a particularly successful budget. On the tax side, certainly, there have been huge and are huge increases, and I'll certainly let you all comment on that. Some people are showing some rather understandable concern in two very different areas. One, I have never heard a gas tax before referred to as progressive. But if that's the new definition within the Clinton administration, I will accept it. There's a disproportionate share on working men and women, especially for those under a certain income. And secondly, the budget doesn't even move much toward mass transit, so they get hit twice if that's what they were after. The second part, though, is that the computation of what defines rich has not really been talked to the American people. And I must tell you, I don't have it quite down yet, but as I understand it, it's defined as the pension you will eventually get, what you would pay for rent, that's an income, what your house could be rented for if you rented it. And that's starting to get into areas to get down low enough to get the taxes needed that I think isn't going to be quite as moving to the American people as it is now. The best part is the American people, I believe quite accurately, are willing to do something at both ends of it. But courage would be having at least an equal number of cuts to taxes. I would be willing to talk about courage then. And as someone who in 1982 and then again in 1986 voted for an increase in taxes with the promise that there would be $3 worth of cuts for every dollar worth of taxes, and a Democratic House and Senate produced 47 cents worth of cuts for those taxes, I am willing to predict, regrettably, that you will indeed see higher taxes, you will not see some of the cuts, and you will see higher, not lower deficits.
Thanks, John. Do you want to comment from the Perot and Concord Coalition perspectives?
Sure.
Do you see this as a courageous budget?
Yes, I do. I see the president as having been courageous in what he has done. I think, as Bo said, not only from Bo, and Bo has the inside perspective here, not only did he think he was putting his presidency on the line, but I think, in fact, from the outside, he was putting his presidency on the line, and if he had really stumbled early on this, we would all be sitting around saying, wasn't that the most foolish thing that was ever done? So I think there is a very fundamental issue here of courage on the part of the president, and I can fault the president and will for not having enough spending cuts, because I think there ought to be more, for not going deep enough, because I think it's an opportunity to do so, for not getting the deficit really under control, which I think he has the skill to do, and I'm hoping he will still do. So I think there's a lot more to go through in order to get it done. Let me make one other very, very, I think, important point. That is, let's not forget why we are having this debate. And if we don't like the BTU tax, or we don't like the high income tax, or we don't like the cut on waterway fees or whatever, let's not forget that we're doing this in order to reduce public consumption, in order to raise savings, in order to increase investment, to raise productivity, to get the society in a situation where, in fact, real incomes begin to grow again. That's what the debate is really all about.
Well, let's turn for a second to the issue of sacred cows. In the mid-'80s, a colleague of ours, now in Albany, did a study of the Reagan administration budget cuts. And he came away from that saying, this is Dick Nathan, for those of you who follow closely the literature of such discussions. He came away saying, Republicans will tell you that huge cuts were made because they came in trying to change this program in a big way. Democrats will tell you that huge cuts were made because they want to say that these programs got gored by the changes. He went out and looked. He said, not much changed. I'm wondering if we could comment a little bit on how much you see really changing here. Let me just give a specific example of that. The superconducting super collider has been on a lot of people's public works hit list. Both Congressman Moody and Congressman Martin served on the Public Works and Transportation Committees. What I notice is that the Clinton budget, like the Bush budget, in spite of the fact, the entreaties of various people, as you put it before, sir, in the know, saying that we don't need this project and it's a huge amount of money and why would we want to do it, and if you're really looking for budget cuts, this is a place you could have them. Both the Bush budget and the Clinton budget include it. Could you comment about the politics of that and the...
I'll be,
Lynn?
either
That was
of
to
us.
both of you, actually.
Well, I'll be happy to go first. It'll probably be more direct than you're used to. The superconducting super collider, in one way, is of course what the future is about. To find the smallest bit of the universe that will tell us more about ourselves and about this incredible universe is worth something. I did that for Leon Letterman, I want you to know, one of the great Nobelists who would have wanted me to say that. Now, having said that, if the former president's from Texas, you can doggone well bet it's going to be in the budget. And if your Secretary of the Treasury is from Texas, it's probably going to stay in the budget. Now, I realize that's not quite as noble as you're used to hearing, but of course it should go. I mean, that's why President Clinton, and I think he has done some good things in the budget, and I've said that publicly and will continue to say that. It's why he can talk about the honeybee program, which, by the way, Sil Conti used to fight for because there's so many beekeepers in Massachusetts. There's a lot fewer beekeepers than there are dairy programs. And you don't see much happening to dairy. And that was my old district. You don't see much happening in a lot of farm programs, even though agriculture is crying a great deal that, you know, they got touched at all. So there really are places. Mr. Nathan was right. Only so far. And that's, if you don't attack the spending, it would grow even more. And when you have a supplemental program that you're adding, at the same time you're talking about spending, you will have the budget document. You may talk about it as a value document. It's a political document. We all know it. You'll have the document, but it will be later, ladies and gentlemen, please. It will be July and August when you'll find out what you're really going to get in spending cuts, not from this document.
Let me make some points. First of all, I disagree with your premise. No, I'm going to talk. I disagree. This is a living room conversation. I disagree with your premise. There are, if you take it down to the line item, something like 485,000 different programs in the budget. And Dutch somehow reaches through all of this and chooses one because he doesn't like it. Well, I happen to like it, and I mean, John and I fought hard for the science programs back when we were in government.
But not for the space station.
Wasn't there when we were there.
All right. Shouldn't be there now.
I'll have that quarrel too. But so we have the moderator who reaches way down and chooses one program. Now, as it happens, Dick Nathan is just flat wrong. Just flat wrong. At the end of the Carter administration, let me give you two numbers. Net interest was 7%. Discretionary, non-defense discretionary was about 19%. At the end of the Bush administration, net interest was about 16%, and non-defense discretionary was about 13%. Now, those are peculiar numbers and all of that. But basically what the program that we had in the 80s was to cut the taxes for your friends, the upper middle class, the upper class earners, put money into defense and run a big debt. That was the program, and that it made a change. It created a change. It something like tripled the amount of the public debt. Decisions make a difference, and Nathan's wrong to say it, and you're wrong on the example that you chose. Now let's choose the collider. You can have all kinds of arguments about whether big science or little science is the right way to go. Am I going to stand up here and say the fact that Secretary Benson is from Texas had absolutely nothing? No. But I'm going to maintain with a straight face it was nothing political about it. It was his deep substantive knowledge of science and the collider that led to his plea for this.
I'm pleased you straightened me out on that because I was otherwise confused.
I'm glad I picked
that particular example was that I had the privilege of serving on the National Academy of Sciences panel that cited the superconducting supercollider, actually handed back a list of potential sites to the Department of Energy.
I served on one for 7 years that cited it both ways 3 separate times.
Right. It was an exciting process, and I just wondered if politics had ended this year, and I guess the answer to that's no. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, I haven't read Nathan's work, but it's certainly not true that nothing was cut in the Reagan and Bush era. If you adjust for prices and purchasing power of budgets, they certainly were cut in a number of safety net areas. They were not very much cut in public works or in those kind of large public expenditures, which tended to be fairly non-political. I don't know if Lynn would agree, but in my 4 years on the Public Works Committee, the Democrats and Republicans had very few partisan differences at all. But on the health and education and on a lot of other committees, there were pretty severe differences on spending priorities. I mean, I think the story of the 80s was really a story of how Republicans wanted to push military spending up a lot more than Democrats, although certainly Carter started it, but Reagan carried it on with the gusto. The Democrat and Stockman was very honest about they wanting to deeply slash social programs, not public works, but social programs. The Democrats in Congress were able to stop those cuts, and there were enough pro-military Democrats so that both sides of the budget went up, although the safety net or pro-poor programs did not go up in purchasing power terms, and many of them were cut quite sharply in purchasing power terms. So I don't know Nathan's thesis, but I don't think I would agree with it as you've expressed it.
Do you want to comment, John? Or no? I'd like to turn this, if I could, to the tax side. And let me make another unsupported allegation. And that would be that, we talk a lot about changing tax rates. But if you look at what happens, we change tax rates up or down, and then we undo it all by changing the definition of income. Well, let me, phrase that in the following way. The allegation would be, maybe we'll get major changes in the tax rates, but they will probably be accompanied by changes in the way we define income that will lessen the burden, the true burden, on upper income folks. Is this country really prepared to sustain a substantially more progressive income tax as the Clinton budget and plan in effect assumes? Or are we in fact going to wind up undoing that through the way we define income or produce loopholes or otherwise change the tax system? Do you want to comment on that?
Well, my experience on the Ways and Means Committee is that we were very effective. The Congress, with President Reagan's help, was very effective in slamming shut most of the loopholes in the '86 tax bill. That was really a bipartisan effort that was where the president did show some real economic leadership. Unlike on the budget side, he showed a lot there. We produced a bill which really was a genuine reform. There were some things about it I didn't like, and everyone in this room could pick at it, but basically it was a big step forward in broadening the base. It did bring down the rates because the rules we were operating under was revenue neutrality, so we had to reduce the rates to broaden the base, and both I think were good. I think given the climate of crisis and deficit fear that is gripping the nation, and I agree that we should be terribly worried about it. I think we can inch rates back up now as long as we don't go too high without opening up all those old loopholes. I don't know how high that is, but I don't think we're busting through that limit at 39 or 41%. So I would think, I'm optimistic that we can move them up and not reopen all the loopholes.
I think if you don't move them up, the plan's dead on arrival. The American people are not going to tolerate a plan which protects rich folks. They're simply not going to do it.
I don't at the moment see, just as almost a mechanical matter, how certainly what you've suggested, that can't happen automatically.
No.
I mean, the base broadening did in fact occur.
Right.
That an awful lot of the loopholes are in fact gone. So
Yes.
that the only way we're going to make those changes is through a legislative process. And I think John's right. I think that it'd be a little hard for someone to stand up with a straight face and start putting in base narrowing measures right at the moment.
Well, John's point is you couldn't get away with a plan that didn't go up in the nominal rates. But do you think the public would be sufficiently alert to blow the whistle on?
Yes.
Yes. That's what I'm saying. Is I think they'd be sufficient.
Right.
Yeah.
I think you will
Investment
get...
tax credits, capital gains treatment? None of those things?
I'm arguing that I don't think that, I think it would be incredibly hard to carry that through a legislative process now or in the foreseeable future.
Some of the pressure for the capital gains differential is going to have been satisfied by the very fact that the top rate on capital gains
We created one, right?
Remains at 28. It's fixed at 28, which it's been since the '86 tax bill. Meanwhile, the top nominal rate is now going to go to 39.1. So that spread now is really significant.
I would add that most people who wanted a differential in capital gains did not view the route to get there as increasing taxes on the other end. And I think we should have a small note here of common sense should rear its ugly head in the midst of the joy of raising taxes. The other part, and I don't disagree that fairness has to be part of tax policy, although we certainly ignored that for years when we were adding special interest legislation on a regular basis. And I think one of the things that is incredibly important is to not let that get started again. Because if you want to see any way you keep people out of a process, it is that, because only people who can afford to get into the process can actually be either helped or you can hurt someone else. So I hope there'd be concurrence. But I do think something has to be added here. In addition to fairness, there is something that happens when you tax. Money and what you do with it moves to either the government or individuals. And at some point, and maybe that's what Americans are reevaluating, you have to all make a decision. Is it government that should make all of those decisions? And the one cautionary note, now that I am a more objective observer, that I would hasten to add, is that jobs are an important goal. And that jobs are not going to come from big businesses. They're going to come in the main from small and medium businesses. And the negatives that government can do through tax and regulation affect that marginal job creation much more than anything we've ever seen in the past. And whether it's this administration or had it been mine, It is something that has not yet had enough attention from anyone, and people are going to be very, very careful, or they will not destroy the goose that laid the golden egg. They'll sell the farm.
I had a point. I think, to disagree somewhat with Lynn on this, when government spends at level X, it is already making those decisions, Lynn. We're talking about financing.
But see, I think we should cut spending.
Well, that's another issue. I mean, maybe government should spend at Y, but that's not a tax issue. If you spend at level X and your revenues are at level Z, that gap has to be made up either through taxing or borrowing. The government is already making the decision. They command those resources already. The question is, how do we finance it? Do we finance it through the front door of a tax system where we know where the incidence is and we can govern the incidence, we can change the tax code? Or do we finance it through the back door, through the monetary system, where there are a lot of side effects and we don't know very well what the incidence is, except we know it has a lot of drag on the society in other ways. So that's the issue, not how many resources the government is going to command. It's not a question, do we raise taxes? What bothers me about the Republican debate so often, Lynn, is that they describe this as a tax issue. If you're commanding the resources, you're already making those decisions. The question is, how do we finance it in the most economically non-destructive way possible? And borrowing it is not the best way.
Let me though, Jim, make an argument for budget cuts. There are a legion of economists in this school who can explain to you that a dollar is a dollar and taxes versus spending and so on and so forth. There's a very important phenomenon here. When you tax people generally in this society, you tax them as a class, very broad tax, BTU taxes, whatever it might be. But when you go after spending cuts, you go after special interests. What the American people expect you to do is go get all those special deals that people have made. Most of them, by the way, are middle-class folks and upper-income folks, and not poor folks, okay? And they've got deals. They've got deals on grazing lands and deals on inland waterways, and we've got tariffs that protect garlic farmers and so on and so forth. I even put in the Pro plan, by the way, that we'd knock down the tariff protection on peanuts, Bo, which I'd never thought of before. But
it certainly didn't occur to any of us. 76 to 81.
But the point is a very important point. The people are willing to go along with this sort of program if, in fact, you're going to go after spending. And Lynn, I don't think it's just big government per se. I think it's who's at the trough, who's getting it. And who's getting it? You go down through all those programs, and Bo's been through them in great care, and to his credit, knocked out a lot of them recently, or at least shaved them some, which is very, very hard. But they're very long lists of programs. They're all in there by design.
John, I happen to agree, but again, you have to bring up almost all of the programs we can all mention so that you can be horrified. And generally, you horrify people on programs outside their congressional district, all right? Just so you understand the base of being horrified.
Right.
Those were all in the Stockman plan. I mean, you got to go back. People don't, we're going to have all this revision. They were all there. They've been there. I mean, I can remember in the House voting for across the board, individual, and you get maybe 27 votes. Sort of the hardcore of both parties. The reality is here that there's been a few steps, and I welcome those few steps. I just don't have the confidence, as much as I like my colleagues or my former colleagues in the House and Senate, to believe they're going to do almost anything with anything but the tax side. And then I think you see the American people saying, regardless of wealth, all right? I'm not talking about, if leading Democratic businessmen have to pay more, and Republicans, if that's the decision of the nation. But at some point, most normal people want to see, I'd say 1 for 1 at minimum. That's what Americans are ready for. And boy, I think it's an incredible opportunity to waste.
But it's not being wasted. I mean, it's...
There's no 1 for 1.
Yes, there is. The last evening, the House budget, the Democratic caucus met. They came out with a list of cuts, which raises it just almost exactly on the button to 1 for 1. And as opposed to Congressman running in the wrong direction, when properly led, I think they're going to do the right thing. I'll make a flat prediction, and maybe I'll be laughingstock a month from now, that this House of Representatives, I can't speak for the Senate, will actually pass the spending cuts that the President is talking about and do them a little bit better. And I think he's going to Bo can speak, but I think he probably would go along with it. I mean, this is what is different. When Ronald Reagan and George Bush put their budgets out, no one believed them. No one took them seriously. They squealed when we put them on the floor for a vote. One year, Jack Kemp was the only person to vote for a Ronald Reagan budget. Not one single other Republican would even vote for it. This time, you're going to see the Clinton budget is going to get, I think, a majority. It's going to get 218 votes or more, and there's going to be an amendment to add $55 billion in cuts over the 5-year period. And I could be totally wrong, but that's
Oh,
the
come
mood.
on, I mean, they pronounced it, it's not going to be you're totally wrong.
No, I mean, no, but you just said a minute ago you don't think they're going to do it. I think they're going to do it.
I said carefully, they'll pass the political document.
They'll pass the budget resolution.
It's the follow-up, when it gets done, when everybody's decided to go to the beach for the summer, when the real work, and you and I know it, Jim, when that gets done.
Let me make some points about cuts. First of all, I don't think there's some kind of theological truth about one-to-one. And there certainly isn't about a kind of one-to-one starting day one. It takes a while when you cut programs and you try to do it in such a way that you don't absolutely wreck program designs. It takes a while for that spending to equal the taxes, which are pretty easy to get from day one. And so about 3 years out in the Clinton program, it does get fairly close to one-to-one, but I don't think there's a real truth there. I mean, I happen to think that bringing the deficit down is probably the single most important structural change that you have to do in the economy, and the fact that the president led the way is the only way that was going to happen. But a more optimistic note, which is that progress occurs, it just occurs sort of slowly. Let me give you 2 examples. One on the entitlement side, and the other on the non-entitlement side of the budget. And you have to look at things, I think, over a long period of time. Take Social Security to start with. A long time ago, John and I put together and presided over the first time that an American president ever proposed anything that it could remotely been considered a reduction in Social Security. I won't tell you the whole boring story, except to tell you that because of that, John and I were personally responsible for the single greatest defeat in one vote by a president in American history. We lost in the House of Representatives by 430 to 5 on our proposal. And we had to go tell the president that that's what was the result of our handiwork. About 5 years later,
Having explained to him, it wouldn't be a big problem.
Having explained to me, no problem whatsoever. About 5 years later, a commission was put together that proposed for the first time that we actually tax Social Security. And by giving everybody the sort of double-blind cover of the commission, it happened. This time, a president just put it in the budget. He just proposed it. And it's going to happen. It's going to happen like that. So you have, in the course of about 12 years, virtually believe me, it's not just a little change, it's a sea change. I mean, I have been in the office with the President of the United States when a proposal to change Social Security to alter its rate of growth was greeted by the advocates, by the sort of original founders of Social Security by saying it was a solemn oath when it was established in 1933, and any president that proposed anything remotely like this not only ought to be, but would be impeached. So there's a change. On Saturday, there is going to be a proposal that for the closing of 41 military bases. It's being closed under a procedure in which we're still at the double-blind process at this point. It's being proposed under a procedure in which the armed services bring up a set of proposals, and they propose them as a group. And that then is sent by the Secretary of Defense to a commission that goes through them and evaluates every one of them and then proposes them as a bundle to the president. And the president then can send them back or send them on to the Congress, but he can't pick and choose, and it goes to the Congress, and the same thing happens. This is the 3rd time we've done this. In each of the last 2 times, the package is passed. It will this time. And we will have gone from, in something like the previous 15 years of having closed about 8 military bases. Once again, John and I have a kind of dolorous history on this too. We tried that and we couldn't get any closed. To have closed something like 126 bases in the course of the last 7 years. So that processes change, views change. It is a very long fight, but you have to stay with it. You have to stay with it for decades.
The one we did in the Carter administration, the proposal that we did, I remember it vividly because I asked Harold Brown, who was then Secretary of Defense, would you like to come while we present this list? And he said, no, I have every confidence you can do it. And, we didn't close one base,
right.
Not one.
The panel, interestingly, has turned to essentially to the question, is the budget deficit really going to come down? And I think I'd like to focus this on that question if we could. We've talked a little bit about the spending side, a little bit about the tax side. In a few minutes, I'm going to invite people to come down to the microphones. What we'll ask is that if you want to ask a question of the panel, that you come down, line up behind one of the microphones, and that when we turn to those questions, that you identify yourself before you give a short and to the point question to the panel for them to kick around and elaborate on. But before I turn to that, let me ask the panelists for their comments on the question, should I bet on the budget deficit really being smaller in 3 years than it is today? Which side of that bet should I take if I were, which of course I'm not, a betting person?
My bet is yes. I'm more concerned about that bet in 6 or 7 years.
I would say it's certainly going to come down as a percentage of GNP or GDP. Whether it'll come down from 5.4 to 2.7, as the numbers now predict, I would be doubtful because the numbers always seem to get worse. But I certainly think it's going to come down and I think the percentage is the crucial number, not the dollar level. I think as a percentage of the economy, it will come down rather noticeably in the 5 years.
The budget is front-end loaded on taxes, and as Bo, I won't say admitted because I'm not putting him in court, but as Bo said, the spending things we'll all see later. Right. So no. Geez, don't put your money on it. Buy shoes for the children or go buy bonbons, something useful.
Gee, you know, I think it's going to come down. I think it's going to come down by probably more because I think the economy is going to perform better. But hell, why ask me? You know, look at the markets. I mean, I spent 12 years in the private sector. I probably oversaw 4,000 or 5,000 major consulting assignments, none of which ever involved anything having anything to do with government, all of which involved the...
You have to say all
I
that.
have to say that all of which kind of involved looking at obscure things like bond rates and shareholder value calculations and how organizations worked. And the long bond, the 30-year bond, has gone down 78 basis points. There are people, forget us, we're not betting people, but there are betting people out there who are betting a ton on this. The market has gone up 250 points. And you can say, well, you know, that's just sort of speculation, but for those of you who are math fans, if you look at the present value of a perpetuity, which remember is a value with a discount, both sides of those have moved in favor of the markets. I mean, the earnings, the long-run stream of earnings have gone up, and the discount factor, the long bound, has gone down. And so that there are a lot of other people besides the people sitting up here who are betting long-term money that rate's going to go down.
Can I just add this? Yeah. I really hope I'm wrong, just so you know. So I think it is important that it goes down, but I do have to mention that some of the greatest stock gains came when the deficit was accelerating at the highest rate. Not that I oppose people making a lot of money in the stock market, but it does not necessarily reflect what's happening to the deficit.
I did a little history because I was in office when Stockman's famous op-ed page piece in the Washington Post appeared about 10 days before the Reagan inauguration. And I remember reading it and thinking that, you know, maybe they can do it. You know, maybe, I don't think so, but maybe they can do it. And I watched over the next couple of months, and I suddenly saw the magic asterisk appear. And I suddenly realized, no, they're not going to do it. They're going to put in the asterisk. And the day the magic asterisk appeared. We didn't have a long bond then, but long-term money rates went up about 15 basis points, and they kept climbing. And so for those of you who believe in financial markets, I've got to tell you that there was an immediate, large, and opposite movement when one plan was greeted as opposed to when another was.
Bose, did you want to comment, Lynn? Or you?
No.
Bose focused our attention on what is an interesting phenomenon. I mean, there are two pieces of historical evidence, okay? Candidates always run against the deficit, and historically, presidents have chosen, given all the tough choices that they face, presidents have chosen deficits rather than the other stuff. And historically, the deficit has been, while it's true that major deficits as a fraction of GDP began in the late 70s and early 80s, it's been a generally rising function since 1960. So you could say the system has been going increasingly out of control. But as you observe, both the stock market and the bond market are betting very strongly against that. And you're saying, sure, you think that's a reasonable bet to take. Let me ask John to comment about what, given the Concord Coalition's activities and also from the Perot perspective, is where the deficit's going to be 3 or 4 years from now different than where it would have been if we'd had a Perot plan instead of a Clinton plan?
Well, the Perot plan, as we developed it, the answer is yes, because we drove the deficit to zero in 5 years. That took out $755 billion out of the budget, taxes and spending. Let me hasten to add that was, at the time, a political plan. It was not an OM. It was not something you would send to the Congress. It wasn't meant to be. But I think, yes, you probably would have had a somewhat more aggressive plan, but in this same direction. And I think it probably would have also projected further out into the future in terms of the cuts.
Okay, let me invite people who would like to ask questions to come to our microphones at this point. Identify yourself and offer us a short and pointed question, if you would. So let's go to the left first.
Yes, good evening. My name is Joe Carvin. I'm at the Kennedy School of Government. And in the Clinton campaign, he talked an awful lot about public investment and the need for public investment. And I was wondering if you could tell me what bridges are going to be built, what roads are going to be built that are going to provide a return on investment to get the economy going again, and what kind of return on investment criteria you're going to be looking at.
There is sort of on the Shenandoah River where Route 81 crosses, right? That very spot there's going to be. No, let me give you categories rather than specifics. And there is, of course, not one penny of pork in this budget. This is relentlessly scrutinized by people who stayed up all night. The parts I want to tell you what's there. Then I want to tell you what you have to do to follow through. What one has to do. The areas that I think you can legitimately call investment, public sector investment of the kind that we've talked about for a long time, and that Clinton talked about in the campaign, are first the quite substantial technology investments that are really represented most of all, I think, by the fairly heavy investments in dual-use technology, by the investments, forecast investments in telecommunications technologies that will be done through the Department of Commerce, and by a fairly substantial investment in manufacturing technology and in manufacturing technology extensions and demonstrations. That's kind of one area. A second is just straight infrastructure work, public works, roads, mass transit, airports, pure and simple public investment. The third is is a fairly substantial investment in education, which is done two ways. Some of it is contemplated investment in facilities. Others are investment in kids. I happen to believe, and again I'd argue it on the basis of sort of hardcore private sector experience rather than some sort of wet democratic view, that investment in human capital matters. But that's sort of where the numbers are. The other side of it is that if the public sector investment is only going to create a return if you manage it to do so. if we dissipate it, if we let it just kind of spread out, if we convert it into pork, it's fair to say, and I'd say, shame on us. And therefore we have to develop ways of managing it, of forcing competitions for it. We can't spread it right out into the departments, into the normal kinds of programs the departments run, or we will have failed on this.
Let me, if I could, do you want to follow up on the?
Well, is there any plans about how to manage that investment? Because I think that's the concern. The concern is if it's just invested in the same way, why would government do it more efficiently than the private sector? Are there any specific plans in terms of trying to set up to manage these investments so that they do reach the goals that you?
Only in the following sense. One of the functions of the National Economic Council is to put in place the part of the White House I'm part of is to put in place the mechanisms that allow that make that happen, and in every single one of the areas we'll have announcements within the next 2 to 3 weeks about mechanisms being put in place to do that.
But as you say, the key question is whether you can't just take public works as a whole, right? Public works is what everybody thought we were spending too much money on, and it was what most of it was being wasted. You have to look at individual projects within public works, and you have to be able to sustain the pressure to pick the projects that happen to be in somebody's district rather than the projects we actually need.
Actually, you're not right. That's not how you do it. If you do it that way, you will overwhelm yourself and you will not succeed. It is sort of like looking at, if I can draw a parallel to the way companies work, doing it. What companies have found more and more is that doing their capital investment projects project by project by project doesn't work. They don't get the rates of return. They have to look at classes of projects. They have to look how they integrate. They have to look at what is the overall business system, logistics management system or factory system or whatever that a company's putting together in order, in fact, to get a rate of return. And the same exact thing is true of public sector investment. So if you did it project by project, you'd get a perverse result. You'd be absolutely guaranteed to waste it.
The businesses do have one great virtue that the government doesn't, which is that the business people themselves have a stake in whether the project actually does something for their company, whereas it is often alleged, at least, that the people who are pushing the individual projects mostly care whether the dollars get spent in their district and not whether any benefits flow to the larger society from it.
Which makes my point exactly. The fact that that's the case, and the fact that even though, given that the incentives are kind of in favor of rationality in a business, project by project investment decisions really don't work very well. I have a lot of evidence on that. Suggests that in an environment where those incentives aren't working in your favor, you have to go at it a different way.
Let me ask our former members of the Public Works and Transportation Committees to comment on the likelihood of major changes in the effectiveness of our decision-making and management with respect to which projects we're doing.
I love.
Can I detect skepticism?
A trace. They will be most efficiently done with first allotted to members of the Public Works Committee, because I'll tell you that's where I got $110 million for my district, and was quite proud of it. I love the smell of concrete being poured. It's a wonderful smell, and it provides jobs. I'm also sure Bo is absolutely right. But just as you had the wonderful news to take to President Carter once, may I assure you, you're going to have some additional wonderful news to take to President Clinton about projects with the Congress and a Public Works Committee. And that's reality. There's nothing cruel or evil about that. The second thing about Public Works projects, as they've been, is that they're heavily road-oriented in this particular budget. Again, going back to my old congressional district, that's quite a plus. If you're from an urban district, it is not such a good thing where you're looking for mass transit. They tend to reward, understandably I might add, union contractors and union workers. That isn't evil. But it is not necessarily, sort of pro-new kind of growth. And after the Gulf War, there was a $40 billion sort of stimulus that came when our allies finally paid up. It just was a blip on the screen. It really produced not one new job that I could ever find a trace of. So without, look, there's always going to be some public works. I'm afraid I just don't get that. I'm not going to be condemning the president. I think he has to do that to work with the Congress a bit. And he does have to get along, and so I'm not going to stand up here and condemn him for that. But to cloak it in anything else is probably a slight error.
Tim, you want to comment too? And then
Well,
turn to
just
the
briefly,
next question.
there is a pretty well-documented list of, last I heard, about $30 billion in public works that met a decent rate of return threshold hurdle. And if they stay within that, I think they're going to be on fairly safe grounds. If they go off doing a lot of sweetheart projects, of course they won't be. But I want to get back for a second to Bo's point. I think it's very important that you think systematically and not project by project. We have to make some big key decisions. They have to be followed through or else not done at all. What do we do with the rail system? The systematic network effects have to be considered. We either are or aren't going to have a high-speed rail corridor between Chicago and somewhere else, or between, you know, we either are or are not going to do. Doing a little bit or a little piecemeal here and there is wasted money. The other thing I hope they'll do is to look at alternatives to concrete, as nice as the smell might be. There are a lot of things that you can get tremendous efficiencies by traffic management and so-called non-hard, non-concrete solutions. You can increase the velocity and flow through bottlenecks with a lot of other ways than just enlarging them. So I hope they'll do that. There's a very high bang for the buck on those kind of projects.
You think they will, Jim? In all honesty.
So, well, I think that the big elephantine projects are mostly, I mean, a lot of them have been done. Like we're talking about transportation, moving people around. What we really need now is the 3 R's: resurfacing, the rehab, and rehabilitation of most of our defense highway systems. We need things that are not the big projects so much as we need to complete the ice system, but beyond that, I think we need to focus on a lot of maintenance, preventative maintenance, and rehabilitation of existing right-of-ways. So I think that's the common wisdom. I think the received wisdom is pretty much on target on that now.
Thank you.
Why don't we turn to our next question?
My name is Chris Fox. I'm a student here. For the sake of argument, assume that you're right in the budget, the president's deficit plan is passed. Are we done? What else needs to be done in the next couple of years? In other words, what's next?
On this problem or on?
On the deficit problem.
Because anybody who's been around Bill Clinton knows that there is no end to the flow. So that John is right in his view about what happens in the years after '97. It begins to go like that. 70% of the reason are the assumptions about the rate of growth of health costs. That's not. I'm not saying that because we're thinking about a health program and all of that. It's just the base. If you look at the baseline in the budget, and then you say, gee, why is it rising in both our estimates and the Congressional Budget Office's estimates? We're not adding new policies out there in the out years. We haven't gotten to the point yet where we can bring them up yet. So it's just sort of the natural rise. 70% of it is the increase in health costs. The rest, virtually all of the rest of it, are various other entitlement programs. Defense is coming down throughout that entire period. It's not defense. The poor non-discretionary entitlements, even given our kind of rigorously structured additions, remain static as a percentage of the budget. It's health costs. And if we don't figure out a way to get a grip on them, the deficit will continue to rise.
Do you want to comment on this?
No, I think that's absolutely right. I think that's the fundamental problem.
I happen to think there's more to it, and I think that, and not in any way to discard what we have to do and have to look at health care. We all are in agreement. But you can't just say, well, that's 70% and sort of the fritter the 30. That's billions and billions. You know, the old Everett Dirksen, pretty soon you're talking about real money here. And it gets back to the fact you're going to have to watch each part of the federal budget. We also have no indication what the health care plan will be, and so prudence would indicate the administration carefully concentrate on that 30%, which may be something they can do something about if they don't get a health care plan that will pass the Congress, for instance. The second part is, your question was, what happens after you pass the budget? I would hope that the President and the administration and the many qualified people that are there watch carefully the appropriations process, so that at the end, what is produced is at least what they said the beginning would be. Because if you just say we passed the budget and go away, it falls apart.
One thing I hope that Congress can restrain itself and the administration can cooperate with, and is not this terrible process of bringing forth these supplementals all the time. I mean, Lynn and I served for 10 years, 8 of which were overlapping, and gosh, I forget how many supplementals came down the pike, always with the blessing of the White House, not always with the size. They choked over the size occasionally, but that process they should really try to stop that.
That's congressional reform, not necessarily up to the President. You shouldn't have urgent, they were always urgent supplementals too. And there shouldn't be additions, and you shouldn't be able to appropriate on non-appropriation. There are ways you could at least manage the flow better, which the Congress has not done.
Let's come to the next question.
Sure. Dimitri Kupinis, I'm a student here in the MPP program and across the river at the business school. I wrote my senior thesis in undergraduate 5 years ago on deficit and debt problems in the U.S. and concluded that we ought to have a balanced budget amendment and that we probably wouldn't solve the problem until we did to the Constitution. And looking back, in the early 80s, the balanced budget amendment to the Constitution almost passed the Congress. The margin of difference, most of the people argued that we're going to grow our way out of it. In the mid-80s, again, pretty close to passing. The margin of difference, they killed it, said, we have Graham, Rudman, and Hollings, that'll probably do it. Just last year, again, very close to passing the House. The margin of the difference, said, well, if we have Clinton or maybe Perot, that'll do it. Leadership will be the solution. And Panetta argued, for leadership on end. Now he's OMB director. I'm wondering, for those of you that don't agree that we should have a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, what can we expect in the next 4 years? And at what point would you say leadership doesn't seem to do it, the Clinton administration doesn't seem to do it, these other things don't seem to do it, and what point would you change your mind and say that you would support a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution?
I don't understand the relationship between the problem and the balanced budget amendment. So you're asking a question that implies somehow this is an answer if all other answers fail. I don't think it's an answer. I don't understand why turning the problem over to a judge is an answer.
Well, of course you could debate it for hours and hours, about the fine details of what would happen if
well, these are not fine details. These
I
are
know, I understand. My
issues.
basic position is that that everyone in the Congress is sworn to uphold the Constitution, as is the President. And I believe that they would. And I believe that if it was in the Constitution, it would work. Obviously, your answer is that you don't think it would work. But I wonder if the other two would ever be, agreeable to supporting a balanced budget amendment.
Well, let me see if I can be real clear about it. I think it's a astoundingly dumb idea. I think that there is no circumstance under which I'd be for it. I think that the experiments around the edges with it did absolutely nothing but make the entire budget process worse and more dishonest. I guess those 3 points are kind of all I'd make on it.
John and Bo, could you just say briefly what you think the fundamental problem is of a balanced budget amendment, why you don't think it would function properly?
The issue here is whether the society wants to make choices and how it wants to make those choices in a free society. Turning the problem over to a judge, when in fact it doesn't really turn the problem over to the judge, but in fact the society still wants to make the same choices and will find ways to do so. Other societies with balanced budget amendments have done very nicely, thank you, of finding ways around them. So I don't see that see, we have a problem sometimes in the society. We think, well, maybe a mechanical fix. Maybe we'll do it with Graham Rudman. Maybe we'll do it with freezes. Let's do it with a balanced budget amendment. That ought to work. This is not a problem that has a mechanical or engineering solution to it. It's a social problem. We went on a spending binge. We decided we wanted to spend a lot of future generations' wealth. We've managed to do so, folks. We did very, very well. Unlike any other of our ancestors in the history of this republic. In 10 years, we managed to do it. Democrats and Republicans and citizens, most importantly, alike. That's a societal choice. We need to deal with it as a societal issue, not as a mechanical fix.
I was sponsor of the amendment, of this astoundingly stupid amendment. And it is neither the panacea that some would suggest, nor is it the anathema that others would. But just as Graham-Redmond may not have worked, many of us think it would have been worse without it. The balanced budget amendment at least forces one into decision-making. It might mean higher taxes, by the way, which was something a lot of conservatives didn't seem to understand. You could go at it a number of ways. But I would suggest that there will always be ways that it will slightly miss in the Congress.
May I make one, and it may sound, it may be partisan observation. We had a president who supported a balanced budget amendment and never sent to the Hill a balanced budget. What's going on here, folks?
Well, John,
I mean,
we
got
have
all
members
these
of
folks-
Congress that never voted to
Of
lower spending, and I don't disagree with that. But,
I mean, so...
but if it had been on the books, he would have had to.
Well, in fairness, I mean,
Actually, there's
might
been a
not-
law on the books
Yeah, right.
requiring a president to
Right.
submit a balanced budget since 1973.
And
That's
presidents
why
used
he's
to do
saying
it.
that
And he never did, and it seems to me that there is zero
But President
evidence.
Clinton is now going to obey that law this year, are you saying?
No,
Oh,
President Clinton.
I just wondered.
No, I think I've been relatively clear on where I stand on this instrument.
And I think, again, I don't think that mechanics are everything. I'm remembering that I was raised in Chicago where Mayor Daley, the old Mayor Daley, functioned under a weak mayor system. So it, believe me, isn't mechanics that drive things, but I still think they can help. And process has some importance.
Let's turn to the question on the right.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Caputo. I'm a junior at the college, and I'm the chair of this Institute Student Advisory Committee. The first thing I'd like to do is thank all of you for coming tonight to speak. This has been very interesting. My question for each of you has to do with the politics of the whole budget situation right now. I'm curious to find out from each of you, from what it seems like tonight, each move that, each cut that is made in the budget, it appears to be something that would happen at a tremendous political cost to a certain group. And I'm curious to find out from each of you what you feel the most important aspect could be cut from the budget so as not to lose President Clinton's any political clout that he might have right now with that particular group.
Okay, let me just, while our panelists are thinking about
Can I
that
just
question.
ask the question? You're saying what cut would engender the least political
Yes.
opposition? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
While our panelists are thinking about the answer to that question, let me just say we're going to have one more question from each mic. So so we close at the hour that we actually said we would.
Let me try a run at that. Because I think the trade-off is really different. What you're amazed by when you're going through that decision process, and I was struck going through it in the last couple of months, how similar it was to similar decision processes I went through like 12, 13 years ago. So is that you have to make a bet. You have to kind of align two different kinds of politics and make a bet on one. If you look at the difficult political choices in any tough budget, and we can differ on the margin or a lot about whether this was or wasn't, there are a lot of tough issues in it. And if you look at those, none of them get you anything in net. None of them get you anything in net. And you can very, very quickly assemble that set of decisions which is going to blow you right out of the water and blow you out of your presidency from almost any complex of them. You have to bet that there's a different politics out there. And that politics is presidential politics. And that the overall package and presentation and vision that a president provides associated with it overcomes the particularistic perspectives that the same people will hold. And you find yourself in this process constantly balancing and thinking about that, because there isn't any set of cuts out there that you can do that people are in net going to like.
I think it's the shrewdest decision President Clinton has ever made. I think that when Ronald Reagan threw in tons of cuts that were going to destroy America, I mean, you remember, he won election big. I mean, so eventually that's not what has to happen. I think if I went back over my career and I looked at the years I was toughest, I probably got my biggest percentages.
I think that's right.
I am suggesting there was always something different out there. I think Mr. Perot captured it better than many have, but this president is a superb politician. That's very good for a president to be. And every time special interest groups, even if they're mine, get up and complain, it adds another point. And it doesn't even matter if the Congress doesn't do it, he will get the credit for trying it, and that will hold him in good stead. He may have other problems later on, but this is a political plus for him.
I would agree. I think both have said it very well. It's a package. You can't pick one thing and say in isolation, how's that will be judged. It's taken as a collective, and if people feel that other people are getting nicked too, they feel totally different about their nick than if they don't have that. But to back up Lynn's point, I mean, I think the tougher someone can be at the presidential level, probably the more momentum they gain for everything they're trying to do. I think Ronald Reagan probably achieved more popular support after firing the air traffic controllers than any other single thing he could have done. You know, it made a lot of people angry, but everybody in America said, God, he's got some gut. And I think that's what Clinton is going to be the beneficiary of. The fact he's perceived and, in fact, is making a lot of tough choices. Courage is the essential ingredient of the package, and that's what's going to carry it through.
Let me make one comment, because I agree with what's been said, and that is, and it's back to the Perot and Clinton, and that is, remember how the president did this. He did not send it to the Hill. He went to the Hill, used that as a platform, and told the American people what he, the president, was going to do, and then immediately went into the country in order to sell it, with the implication being, I'm going to make you pass, Congress, what the people want, which is what I'm delivering. And I think that's critical. It has to be fair and balanced, but then he has to sell it.
It is an interesting commentary on where we come in our national political life when special interests turn out to be a negative. And it has something to do with the fact of how many other people are paying attention now to what's going on, which I think, again, comes back to the Perot and other phenomena of people really all of a sudden focusing and understanding these issues in a way that seems different. And that, I think, bodes well for the future if we can capitalize on it. Let's come to the question on the next.
Greg Elkin, I'm a research fellow here. Secretary Martin, you talked about very briefly about regulation reform, which is not a part of this package. Do you believe that it needs to be, and if so, what are some ways that regulation reform can contribute to the deficit reduction?
Very quickly, regulation and the cost thereof can be, I would say, even not in addition to, but maybe even surpasses for taxation, small business decisions to marginally higher because they have so little room to absorb. It is also where philosophically there'll be a great deal of pressure and you're not going to know it. I mean, not many people bluntly follow regulatory reform. I mean, you can write, boy, do we hate the Vice President's Council on Competitiveness. The reality is there's already been regulatory changes. That is a difference between the two parties. And the cost of rule and regulation, as the cost of mandates back to states and cities, is a fairly well hidden but increasingly important part of change that has to occur. So I think you can do it department by department. And I would hope, even under pressure, the Clinton administration is able to avoid some of the real regulatory nightmares that people want to put on. They're all well-intentioned. Every new regulation is well-intentioned. The costs are horrendous.
By the way, just to add a point, I think that the most major significant hunk of regulatory reform occurred under Jimmy Carter in the transportation field. It isn't really Democrat versus Republican. A lot of respectable Democrats believe that we can deregulate markets when there is there's a possibility of competition. We can have entry and exit. But they don't want to deregulate markets where you have toxic waste or all sorts of things that have side effects.
But I think if I may compliment the President again, the idea that, for instance, with the Superfund, we actually began removing toxic waste other than just continuing court costs and regulatory battles, is one we could all support. Maybe taking care of some lawyers, too, would be helpful.
Let me add one point. You do try to learn. And to follow up on a point that the Secretary made, that if you take the Superfund, I think it's broadly considered that the objectives are hard in abstract, in concept to dispute. The issue really is, does a kind of command and control environment or regime accomplish it at the least cost and accomplish the most at the least cost? And the Clean Air Act, for example, the last year before last, began to experiment with some more market-based, which are very controversial, but some market-based approaches to regulatory to regulation, which arguably can be considerably cheaper and considerably less of a burden. There's a lot of debate and argument about, for example, beginning to move the Superfund so that it reflects that kind of change. So you can try to begin to look at regulation in a way that will incur less cost and less burden.
Great. Final question from the floor, and then I'm going to ask each of the panelists to make a short comment.
My question is based on...
Can you tell us who you are?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Matt Anestis, and I'm a sophomore at the college and member of the Institute of Politics. My question is based on one of Lynn Martin's assumptions, and so it's directed primarily at her, although I'd be interested in what the rest of you think very much. If the Clinton plan does not work and the budget deficit increases, what do you see happening 4 years from now, 8 years from now, 12 years from now? Will there be a Republican or Democrat that will step in and make a tough choice? Do you think it's going to take us falling into a recession or a depression in order to do something? Or what do you think will be the final solution if it's not Clinton's plan?
Well, if for a moment I can judge probably for my colleagues and then let them speak, I assume that most of them think in 4 years that Clinton will be reelected, and I probably hope it's a Republican. I mean, I think we can start with this basic philosophy. Having said that, again, I would also think that my colleagues and I all hope he succeeds. The question is this. Some things aren't as true as we once thought. Obviously, there's very little relation between deficits and interest rates, which sort of is truly back-asswards from what most of us were taught in economics. The deficit is up and interest rates are down. But I also think there's a belief that if you keep on spending, what are we doing to the next generations? And I think that has been a Republican belief. It's one that President Clinton has said he shares, and that's, then let's work together on it. Unless there's control of spending, you will turn into more and more just a high-tax European economy that freezes people within classes. What we have to talk about is opportunity and growth, and at the same time, that control. So I guess I would say, although I do not kneel at the shrine of the balanced budget, I still make the sign of the cross, and I think we do have to move towards greater control of the spending side, which is simply, not for President Clinton, although for him too, the most difficult thing for Congress to grasp and to move with. And until we see that part of the picture, I don't think anyone can make real projections for 4 to 8 years to 12 years. But whoever the next president is, I hope she's able to do an even better job.
Other panelists want to comment on that particular
Well,
question?
I think you're asking if the plan doesn't work, what will happen? What will happen next? Will someone come in a kind of crisis atmosphere and take over and make it work?
Yeah, if...
It's hard to know that. I think that there's a likelihood that the plan will work in the sense of bringing down but not eliminating the deficit. I don't share with Lynn the philosophy that spending is evil. I think there's good spending and there's bad spending, and you've got to look at the spending and decide whether it's worth the private spending that's foregone because you're engaging in public spending. There's a lot of foolish private spending too. Spending isn't always better just because it's in the private sector. That's not a religious statement. It's a question of looking at it one item at a time. Regarding interest rates, I don't agree on that. I think when we're in a slack economy, yes, there's very little relationship between, as we are now, between interest rates and deficits. But when we're in a tight economy, when labor markets are tight and when unemployment is down to a level that's more socially desirable, like 6 or below, we would hope we'd get below, there is a very definite relationship between interest rates and the demand on the credit markets generated by the government. So, but I think that, but back to your basic question, I think that I'm very optimistic that something will happen. I think the country's ready. I think Perot showed that. I think he moved the whole debate tremendously to the side of serious deficit reduction. I think we owe him a great debt for that. And I think Bill Clinton to be congratulated that he picked up on that and has carried it as he has.
Let me turn now to each of our panelists in turn, because we're close to our witching hour, and ask each of them to offer any comment they'd like, anything that hasn't been said that should have been, or any other benediction that each would like to offer us. Bo, let me start with you, since you've traveled the farthest today to come to join us.
You need to drink more. I think we're at a crossroads. I've been struck again back in the White House about the degree to which a president's responsibilities are really fundamentally different than anybody else's. In the following sense, that it's the special interest argument writ large, and this isn't a Republican or a Democratic point. It is that the entire world out there believes that they can peck just a little bit off the kind of center of U.S. society and the economy, that just a little bit of protectionism will, just a little bit of spending, that just a little bit more here to benefit need, and really what presidents wind up having to do, they don't get many good choices in this, is that they wind up having to defend that center. And we're at a funny point with respect to that, because I think that we evidenced over the course of the last 12 years that you really can put the center at risk. And we now are at a crossroad about that. That if we proceed, and for whatever reason, what the president has proposed doesn't begin noticeably to solve this problem, and we don't follow on, this economy and therefore this society will continue to limp along. It'll continue to have all of the sort of technical attributes of a poorly performing economy, and as a result of that, will have will increasingly have the attributes of a less pleasant society. On the other hand, the advantages, the opportunities are absolutely enormous. I mean, what's beginning to be clear is that despite a lot of the views expressed and written about in the middle 80s about the competitive position of this economy, we are incredibly well positioned competitively. The way the world economy is going leads directly into our strengths. What we've seen is that our principal competitors on the world scene have really, in some respects, much deeper and much more fundamental problems than we ever suspected, and probably than we do. And I guess I've said this about 3 times, and that I think that where we are is at an extraordinary crossroad, and that this president has an opportunity to either move the structural barriers away, i.e. to solve the problem, and to reap, in political terms and for the economy and economic terms, enormous benefits, or not to solve them and be a one-term president. And he knows very well that's the choice he's got.
I think that if we had read the press about President Clinton in the first 4 or 5 weeks, we had this sort of incompetent running through the White House and the transition going relatively poorly, and sort of, you know, the the sky is falling. And if we read the press about the last 6 weeks, we now have Gandhi mixed with Ronald Reagan. Neither probably were totally correct. Although I'm sure were I President Clinton and his allies, I would want the latter rather than the former to be what's left. But I think this president has, both by perspective and by his own innate abilities and talents in politics, recognized something that I've come to believe. And that is, no matter if you're a 4-year or an 8-year president, you have 6 months. That first 6 months, maybe 8, defines it. Other things will come, and you may even be remembered for them. There may be other important parts, especially in foreign policy, that you cannot have any knowledge of. But that first time fixes, for most people, what a president is going to be about, is concentration on the deficit and the incredible salesmanship that I think he is exhibiting. Show not only that he wants to be an activist president, but his intent is to be one that, unlike the Carter administration, and it was able in many ways, that was on an attack or a blame, he is again reemphasizing the words of hope, of change, and of opportunity. As a Republican, I resent it, but I also admire it. And as an American, I hope he succeeds.
Well, I think that Lynn and Bo have said it very well, both of them. I agree with what they've said. We are at a very critical moment. I think it's the midnight hour, or maybe it's 5 after 12, in terms of getting something going in terms of deficit reduction. I really was beginning to despair about 6 months ago that this country had the political will to grapple with these issues, because they broken in pieces are so intractable. But lumped together and with the right mix of political leadership and atmosphere of urgency, it looks like we're moving. I think that the country is lucky that someone with the kind of energy and courage came along to run for president or be elected as president that Bill Clinton did, and I'm not just sitting here to praise him. I think he is genuinely committed to a very tough task here, and he's willing to stake everything on it. The Democrats haven't taken over the White House in 16 years, and if they blow it this time, it won't be just Bill Clinton's career. It'll be, to a great extent, the Democratic Party, which will probably be far more than 16 years before they're given another shot at the White House. So I think that what we're witnessing is an extraordinary confluence of energy and courage and commitment and skills. And I think this budget is, while it falls short in some areas, we could all agree on it should do more. I think that it is really quite remarkable that this is now the document everybody is working off of, and the prospects of its passing are actually quite high. And I feel tremendously different about the political process today than I did not very long ago. So I'm feeling very good about it.
I think it's hard to overestimate what's at stake here. I mean, the character of a free society is that we are here to determine some of the rules and regulations and choices that define the well-being of the citizens. And that's really what we're talking about, getting this deficit under control for the well-being of the citizens. There really is that relationship. The second point is that we, as the current generation in this free society, have a fundamental obligation to be good ancestors. And that also means making these choices. So I applaud the president, and I think all of us, as we're here tonight and in many other forums, ought to continue to support him in the general direction in which all of this is going, so that we can fix this problem and realize for ourselves and future generations the enormous energy and promise that this society has.
I just want to say in conclusion a couple of things. First, we've heard some interesting controversy here tonight, which I think was both useful and intriguing. We've also heard some interesting predictions, and I just want to remind our panelists that we have this all on tape, and so we can revisit these predictions in a couple of years and see how we did. I want to thank our panelists for coming tonight and for providing such an interesting interchange on these issues. Many of these questions are going to be with us for a while, and I think we've launched an interesting discussion. I hope we can reconvene it at some point. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for being with us.
In the years after 97. It begins to go like that. 70% of the reason are the assumptions about the rate of growth of health costs. That's not, I'm not saying that because we're thinking about a health program and all of that. It's just the base. If you look at the baseline in the budget, and then you say, gee, why is it rising in both our estimates
on investment criteria you're going to be looking at?
There is sort of on the Shenandoah River where Route 81 crosses, right? That very spot there's going to be. Let me give you categories rather than specifics. And there is, of course, not one penny of pork in this budget. This is relentlessly scrutinized by people who stayed up all night.
You can hurt someone else, so I hope there'd be concurrence. But I do think something has to be added here. In addition to of cuts for every dollar worth of taxes. And a Democratic House
federal spending. He was a member of the Wisconsin State Legislature and also